upgrading and migrating domains, and interoperability. In this nugget, we're talking about upgrading and migrating domains. And then we're kind of killing two birds with one stone and also addressing a totally separate topic of interoperability. We're starting off by talking, first of all, about a domain upgrade. This is a very simple way to go to a Windows Server 2008 domain, and it's probably the easiest way to go and least expensive. But you could also have a domain restructure, and for this, you might need to have some additional hardware, but it's also very useful if you want to reorganize how everything appears in your domain infrastructure. Then you could have an upgrade, then restructure, if you want to gradually migrate from one kind of a domain to another, or if you want to collapse domains and consolidate some things. We also talk about the Active Directory migration tool, which would be very useful in the restructuring process, because that's how you can migrate accounts from one domain to another. We'll also talk about the Active Directory Federation services, which is where maybe you want to exchange resources with some other organization, but you don't want to build a forest trust. And then we'll also talk here about interoperability, which is kind of a loaded bullet right there because there's a lot of different things involved there, in making sure that your Unix clients and Windows clients can work with other respective operating systems. Did you ever regret that you did something in haste? I know that I certainly have. I was supposed to meet somebody, and I was driving over to the meeting, and I wasn't actually even late, but I was kind of anxious to get there. And I was going through a construction zone on the highway here in Arizona, and unfortunately, we have those photo radar things. I don't know if they have those in your area, but this photo radar is just a van or it's stationary equipment on the side of the highway that's unmanned, and it's got a radar gun in it, and when it detects that you're going too fast, it automatically takes your picture through the windshield and then also takes a picture of your license plate, and it winds up looking something like this. Although this didn't scan in very well, but you can kind of see there that it took my picture as I was going a little too fast. Let's see, I think it says up here. Yeah, I was going 68 in a 55 apparently. So you can see that, you know, they give you the ticket, and of course it cost me $181. Gosh, because I was going too fast. There's my wonderful picture. I probably actually look better in that picture than I do in real life, but you can see those didn't scan in very well. Anyway, yeah, sometimes you get a little bit hasty. It's going to cause you a problem, and certainly that's going to be the case also if you're a little bit too hasty in upgrading your Active Directory domains and forests. And one of the places you want to make sure that you take your time in going through all of this is if you upgrade or restructure your domain. Let's go ahead and take a look at 3 different ways of doing this. The first one is to do just a plain old domain upgrade. And this is what you're going to do if you want to just do an in-place upgrade of your existing domain controller. So, for example, maybe it's running Windows Server 2003 right now, and you just pop in the Windows Server 2008 DVD, and you just do an upgrade. That certainly is possible. One thing you do have to keep in mind if you do a domain upgrade is that nowhere in your domain can you have any NT4 domain controllers. And as a result of that, you also have to be at least Windows Server 2000 native domain functional level or better. Now, of course, as a quick note, as a quick precaution, this is not really an exam issue. I recommend that, if possible, use some kind of a product such as Acronis or VMware may have this as well nowadays, where you can take an existing hard drive and send the whole thing to a virtual machine. And then you can just perform the upgrade in VMware, for example, and see how the upgrade goes and see if it destroyed anything or anything like that. Normally, it goes pretty well. There's really very little complication in this kind of a scenario where you do your domain upgrade, because it's very simple, and you just do your upgrade and the computer restarts. Now you have a Windows Server 2008 domain controller. Of course, you do also want to do other things such as running AD prep, RODC prep, forest prep, domain prep, and GP prep, like we have discussed in previous nuggets. So I want to make sure that your schema is all up to date and ready to accept Windows Server 2008. Another advantage of this is, especially if you're in a tight economy like we are at this time of this recording, it doesn't require you to pay for any new hardware. You can use your existing hardware for that, and of course you'll also want to do this during off hours, so there goes the weekend. So you'll want to do that, of course, during off hours, because if something does go wrong, and it probably won't, but if it does, then you don't want to affect any users that may be trying to use the domain services. I also recommend that you take an image, so that you use some kind of third-party product or any kind of a backup of your existing Windows Server 2003 or 2000 domain, and you can use ghost images or any other kind of imaging software if you like as well. That way, if something does go wrong after, even if you plan it out well and something still goes wrong, you can reverse back to your snapshotted image and probably be back up and running within just a few minutes. Also, the other advantage of a domain upgrade is it doesn't involve any restructuring. You don't have to come up with a new plan or a new forest structure or think about where to collapse domains and decommission domains and all that kind of stuff. Very, very simple in all of those respects. Now, another kind of an upgrade that you might consider would be a domain restructure. This is where we already have in mind that we may not like our existing domain or forest structure, and so we want to go ahead and change things. Maybe we change the name of our company, so we also want to change the name of our domains. Or maybe we have some branch office domains that don't really exist anymore. I mean, we still have the domains, but those physical branch offices were closed. Or we used to have a branch office in Toledo, now it's moved to Tucson. But the name of the domain is still Toledo. So we might have some changes like that we want to make within this. Now, what you'll do in this kind of a case is you'll just install a brand new Windows Server 2008 domain and or forest. And once you have done that, you'll just kind of let it sit there for a while. One of the advantages of this kind of a restructure is once you've created the new structure there, you can take your time in migrating accounts from your existing domains. And the way we could do that is we could use tools such as the Active Directory Migration tool, which is available for download from Microsoft. It's not included in the bits with Windows Server 2008. And the thing that I like about ADMT is that it kind of makes you a little bit nervous at first, because you don't want to trigger a migration of accounts from one domain to the next and then be concerned about some kind of corruption in the account or something not going quite right or some kind of an inconsistency in the transfer. Well, with ADMT, you can test it kind of at first. You can kind of do a what-if scenario to see if it would properly migrate the accounts if you were to do it. And then once you see that it's able to successfully and safely do that, then you can pull the trigger and actually perform the migration. So you can do those migrations. And then when you do this, you will then redeploy or decommission your old hardware, because now all of my accounts on my existing domains are on my new domain. So therefore, these old domain controllers don't really have a purpose in life anymore. So what am I going to do with them? Number one, I might redeploy them. Maybe, yeah, I don't have that domain controller anymore, but boy, we sure could use another file server. So I'll throw a couple more hard drives in there. Now it's a file server. Or I'll decommission it if it's really old hardware and maybe give it to charity or something like that if I really have no other use for it. By the way, if you do something like that and you decommission it, I do recommend that you use some third-party product to wipe the drive first, or if it's a Windows Server 2008 machine, you can also use BitLocker. And it's a little outside of our scope, but there are BitLocker methods for encryption that you could use that then when you decommission a BitLocker drive, it's permanently scrambled and impossible to read. Also, the other thing about a domain restructure is between the time that you install this new domain and you migrate from your existing domains, you can take as long in between this as you want to. This could be, a month between these two steps. It could be a year between those two steps, whatever you want it to be. So you can kind of have a gradual migration whenever you're ready, and that way you're not in a mad panic, try to get the thing done by the end of the weekend and when everybody shows up back up on Monday. So it's a little bit more useful that way. Also, it will require, however, more hardware. So you do have to consider that, because not only do I have to have my new hardware for my new domain and or forest, but I still retain my existing hardware from the former domains. So you will have to have a little bit more of a financial investment in this. And I say a little bit more, but in a large organization, could be a lot more. Now, one thing you might want to consider, and Microsoft doesn't actually recommend this, but I do think that it is possibly a good way to go, at least something to think about, and that is to use virtualization. So that, once again, maybe I have a new Windows Server 2008 domain and or forest. If I'm really tight on hardware, I could install a new those domains and forests in virtual machines, at least for the time being. I wouldn't leave them there permanently, but I would do that for the time being, and then once I've migrated things safely, then I possibly could migrate all of the virtual machines into physical hardware, and then that way I can help to reduce the additional hardware that I might need. Now, similar to the last thing we looked at is a final way of doing the migration. That would be an upgrade, then restructure. What we do with this is we upgrade our existing domain and forest, just like we looked at on our first whiteboard here. Okay, nothing unusual about that, pretty simple and straightforward, and initially it does not require any new hardware. But then what we'll do is, when we're ready, maybe we also want to change our structure of our domain and our forest, so we want to restructure. So then we'll install a new domain and or forest, and of course it'll be Windows Server 2008. And then what we'll do is we'll upgrade, or rather migrate the objects from the upgraded domain into the new domain down here. And we'll just do it that way. And then what we can also do is we can just leave behind any, accounts that we aren't actually using anymore, accounts that we might have found out were stale from people that didn't actually, even exist anymore, or at least left the company. They still exist. Maybe we wish they didn't, but anyway, they do. So anyway, we got old accounts that we're not going to migrate over, and we're just not going to bring over all of the junk. It's a good time, as you migrate the objects from the upgraded domain to the new domain, to just kind of clean house, make sure that you have the kind of structure that you want, maybe reorganize your organizational units and the like here as well. So those are the three methods for doing this. There's an upgrade, there's a restructure, and then there's an upgrade, then restructure. And of course, all of those relate to one of the exam objectives that calls for designing support, identity, and access management components. Boy, could Microsoft put any more words into that. And one of the objectives for that involved is to plan for domain or forest migration, upgrade, and restructuring. Alright, now I do want to show you a tool here called the Active Directory Migration Tool. Two reasons why I want to show this to you. Number one, there's really not a whole lot of demos in this particular nugget, simply because a lot of these things are pretty narrow in focus for their purpose, and you don't need to know every command line switch and next finish and every wizard and all those sorts of things. You simply need to know which technologies will get you from point A to B, so to speak. However, the Active Directory Migration Tool is a pretty cool tool, and I think you'll find that you'll like it for many purposes in terms of migrating accounts. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Here I've got my accounts here for the server manager that appear on DC Nugget 4. This is in my, look at, west.nuggetlab.com domain, and there's all of my accounts, okay? Or some of my accounts. Let's say I wanted to migrate a user account over. We can, of course, migrate all of these, but let's just say that we're testing it out with this user who's going to move from BizB up to, our organization in, Building 2, and we just want to see if we can successfully move an account over as a test. We don't want to move everybody over just in case everything blows up. Well, I already downloaded the Active Directory Migration Tool. One thing to keep in mind is this is the Windows Server 2008 version is 3.1. So the ADMT tool version 3.1. Older versions are for other versions of Windows Server. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at it. I've already installed it here, and it should appear under Administrative Tools, and then the Active Directory Migration Tool. Again, this is one of those things you don't have to memorize every single step of everything that goes on with this, but you kind of don't really have to because it's very easy to use. You simply right-click. There's not a lot of interface with this, except for everything is done from a right-click. What I'll do is I can do a reporting wizard to see what would happen if certain instances took place, or I'll just use the user account migration wizard to make things quick for our current purposes. And as you can see, all we have to do is to specify the source domain, which is going to be west.nuggetlab.com. And this might be the case if I'm trying to collapse my domain. Maybe West is not really a necessary domain anymore. We don't really need to spend the additional server hardware to have additional domain controllers and so forth. We want to collapse everything into nuggetlab.com, and we're testing that out here. So I'm going to move from West to nuggetlab.com, and then I want to select users from the domain. You can also have an include file. There's a text file that you can kind of pre-bake for this if you want to. I just as soon use the interface for most purposes. So I'll just click on Add here, and I'm going to look for BizB user something or another. See, there's a bunch of accounts. I think I said 8. So I'll double click on that one, and there they are. The next thing I'll do here is to specify the target OU where I want them to go. Now I'll just click Browse, and I'll say, in corporate, building users, 2 users. Okay, how about that one? So as we put them into that item location, you'll see that the target OU appears up here. Then as I click on Next, there's a number of different things that we can choose. If this user had roaming profiles, then we could translate their roaming profiles so that it will reflect the new domain in their roaming profile. Otherwise, if you didn't select that in then you can have inconsistency in that user's profile. We also want to possibly update the user's rights if they'll have different rights in the new domain. Migrate associated user groups as well. Now, I don't really actually have those, so it really wouldn't matter if I check that or not. But that user account doesn't happen to be the member of any security group. If they were, I could migrate that user's security group as well. And if I've already updated, or rather migrated user accounts previously that were already members of that group, and I've already moved that group into my domain, then I can also update previously migrated objects. Then we'll go ahead and click on Next. And we'll just say, if there's a problem, do not migrate source object if a conflict is detected. This might be the case if, for example, I already had a user account by that same exact name in that same exact OU, for example. Well, that would be obviously a problem. And it'll notify you that if you do have a problem with it. But I'm just going to go ahead and click on Finish here. It'll tell us it examines and copies one. We should see no errors. And it looks like it's completed, so yeah, no errors. If you click on View Log, it kind of gives you a pretty cool view of all the different things that it did with this. And as you can see, once again, it doesn't look like there were any problems in particular with this, so everything should be pretty good to go. Now all I'm going to do is to close this up real quick and go back to Server Manager. Now let's go to Building Two Users, and we should see that account in there. Except I don't see it. Let me refresh the screen. There it is. Okay, Bisbee User 08. So, successfully migrated the account. Real easy to do. And just know that the Active Directory migration tool is what does it. Not only does it migrate user accounts, but also groups, as you can kind of see from the implication there, as well as computer accounts if you want. Now, next we're going to be talking about things such as working with other platforms and operating systems, and this relates to an exam objective that says Plan for Interoperability that includes inter-organizational authorization and authentication, application and authentication interoperability, and cross-platform interoperability. Yes, once again, a whole lot of words, but there's really nothing specific in those exam objectives. But I'll tell you what things are going to help you along the way here. First thing, you want to take a look at something called Federation Services. I guess I should spell that out since that's the first place I use it, but Federation Services, okay, or Active Directory Federation Services, as it's also known. What does this do? Well, this helps us to avoid a forest trust. Maybe we have two companies that do some things together, but they're not necessarily, it's not a merger, it's not that close of a relationship, that sort of thing. We just need some resources. For example, maybe I've got one company that's a camera manufacturing company. They make cameras. And I've got another company that's a lens supplier for my cameras. Well, we don't want to get into a situation where we get low on lenses, and then we have to call the lens company, and then they have to spin up and make a whole bunch of lenses for us, but then we get behind in production because we don't have the lenses yet. So, what we want to happen is for the lens company to be able to peek into a small, isolated part of our inventory database, and whenever the lens inventory drops below a certain threshold, it'll automatically trigger an order for them, or one of their people can look on the website to see how many lenses we still have in stock. And then when they see that we're low, we'll just go ahead and make an order. That way something doesn't get overlooked. Well, we can do that without doing something as comprehensive as, a complete trust or something like that. We don't want the whole thing there. We're just sharing a little bit of information there. And that can especially be important because we might even be competing in certain places. Yeah, I sell lenses, or this company sells lenses to my camera company, but they also sell lenses to other manufacturers. So, manufacturers that are my competitors. So I don't want them to see my entire database and then potentially sharing information that they're not supposed to share with my own competitors. So, it's like we're not that close and we don't want to be, quite that tightly integrated. I mean, we like the lens company, but we're just not ready to start taking long walks on the beach with them and listening to Karen Carpenter music and all that kind of stuff. Kenny G and that thing. So what we want to do is not have that comprehensive trust. And we also don't want to have a porous firewall. I mean, if we set up a forest trust with those people, we might have to open up quite a few holes in the firewall in order to be able to share resources across a forest trust. Maybe we just aren't too comfortable doing that. So instead what we'll do, instead of a forest trust, is we'll connect to a web application instead. Now, what we'll have there is we'll have a resource and an accounts organization. If I own the camera company, then I would be the resource organization because I will have the database the lens company wants to look at to see how many lenses we have left in stock. And the way that'll be done is, I'll have to work with some web developers with this. I'll create a web page that will peek into that isolated portion of my database, and it may also share some other information. And then somebody from the Lens company can open up the web page and access whatever they are authorized to. And of course, most of the time when you create these, it's just like the camera company and the lens company. We have a very specific, isolated purpose. We're not opening up general trust relationships so that if we ever do decide to share something, it'll always be available. We already have that in mind in advance. And an example of this is Microsoft and the ADP company. That's the payroll company. Microsoft wanted to establish a relationship with them. I don't really know all of the details, honestly, but they wanted to do it, I imagine, so that, for example, when a new employee came into Microsoft, they could also automatically go to ADP's website and register that new employee, put in their pay grade, all of those sorts of things, yet not completely access ADP's full database and see, other clients that they have, maybe Oracle or, other companies that are out there. Likewise, Microsoft doesn't want ADP to look at a web page that would show all of Microsoft's data. So, Microsoft wanted to be able to control this in a very tightly controlled fashion. And why is that? Well, that's because Microsoft is very controlling and they want to own everything. No, just kidding. But there's really good reasons for that. So there's usually a very specific purpose with Federation services, and a good part of this, it only uses common web ports. 53 for DNS, 80 for HTTP, then there's your HTTPS. All of those sorts of things are already open in most cases for most corporations that already host a website. So you probably don't even have to open up anything extra. It's already all there. And then what you need to do in order to make this work is you'll have your IT administrators and your web developers will have to collaborate on this, because this is not normally something that IT administrators do on their own. This will require web developers and web programmers and people that are very, pretty up to date with how to develop websites. Most IT administrators could probably throw one together if they wanted to for their own personal website, or do something that's pretty okay, but nothing quite that elaborate. So you will have to work with somebody else. Now, for a full explanation of Active Directory Federation services, why don't you go ahead and take a look at my 70-640 exam prep guide. And this one, all of those particular nuggets or videos have a pretty full discussion on this whole thing. But I wanted to just at least show you a diagram from that so you could get an idea for how this works. Maybe I've got a user out here, maybe they're a home user, or maybe they're on the road with their laptop. And what they want to do is they want to access this web server. Their boss just told them to enter in www. Let's put in nuggetlab.com. Okay, and they're supposed to be able to access information about how many lenses I've got left or something like that. In reality, they don't really see all of this other stuff happen that's involved in this picture, but what really happens is there's a Federation Services resource proxy that identifies that they are trying to access this Federation server in reality. Well, they can't do that quite yet because they haven't been authorized or authenticated at all. So the resource proxy will redirect them back to an accounts database like Active Directory Services or LDS up here. And the thing is, it doesn't know exactly how to get there either, so this account proxy does, and the account proxy will know how to get to this location. Then once they're authorized with their user account, then the Federation server will actually pass back a token to this user to be able to use and be able to then access this web server. And there are also cookies that are involved so that the user doesn't have to constantly re-authenticate. For example, if there was a click-through on this web server for which they still also had access, then we wouldn't have to completely re-authenticate them and go through the entire process all over again. And this is all encrypted, by the way, using certificates, and the certificates are involved in each one of these servers throughout so that we can authenticate that they are actually the servers that we think that we're communicating with. And once again, my 70-640, and I'm not trying to sell you another set of videos, honestly, but that one goes through all of the how to set it up and everything like that. At this level, our main goal is to just identify technologies that Microsoft has available to us that would allow us to do things such as this, where once again, we don't have to set up a whole forest trust, but we can still access resources from a partner company that we want to do some work with. Alright, now let's go ahead and talk about interoperability here. Now, I run a strictly Windows environment, so I don't really have any, Tivoli servers, or I don't have any Lotus Notes anywhere. I mostly run Microsoft products. I don't have any, Oracle anywhere, Sun Directory servers. So I don't really have anything directly to show you in terms of those interoperability, and you don't need to memorize that particularly anyway. But one thing you do need to know about interoperability is which products or features of Windows Server 2008 you would need to use if you did have some kind of an interoperability situation. One of the first things I would know about here is the Identity Lifecycle Manager, or ILM, FP1, which is Feature Pack 1. ILM Feature Pack 1 does this. It stores identity from other products in something called a metaverse. And what this will do is it'll take accounts, for example, or other identifiers from some other product. Maybe I've got, for example, accounts that are located in Lotus Notes, or I've got some kind of accounts that are located in an IBM Tivoli directory server. Well, I can take those accounts and put them in the metaverse, and which is actually going to be stored, by the way, in a SQL 2000 or better database, and then I can equivocate that account to something that exists in my Windows Server 2008 Active Directory domain. And by the way, it's not only for working with, some kind of an oddball other, operating system that you might not be accustomed to. It can also work with Microsoft products. For example, if I've got Exchange Server 2007 or 2003 or 2000, any current version of Exchange, what would be cool? Well, what would be cool is if I got a new employee and I added their user account into a SQL database, or their, information about that user. Well, it would be cool if when I created that account, it automatically also created an Exchange mailbox for that user. Well, you can do that with Identity Lifecycle Manager, and it'll help to significantly cut down on the amount of administration necessary to do things even as simple as creating a user account. Because now, once I create that user account and we have their data entered in the database, it can also automatically create all of that they need for Exchange. Another interoperability tool that we'll have here is something called Identity Management for Unix, and that's useful if I have some Windows users, but they're in a predominantly Unix environment, and I need to make sure that they can access resources and that their identity as an LDAP user is identifiable in a NIS environment. So I need to install those role services. And by the way, notice that I say here that it's role services on Windows Server 2008 that we do that with. At first glance, it's real easy just to go into Server Manager here and say, okay, it's a role services, so I'll go ahead and add roles, and then I'll click on Next, I guess, and then I don't see anything there about identity management or Unix or anything like that. Well, that's because it's not there. What you have to do with this thing is first you have to go to the roles, and then once you do that, it will then expose the role services. And you can see here it says right there, add role services. And then we have our identity management for Unix, including Server for Network Information Services. That's what NIS was that I mentioned a little while ago. And what this particular tool will do is it allows you to use like the Windows tools to be managed from a single set of administrative tools so that you can manage both the Unix and the LDAP accounts. And then there's the password synchronization, which does exactly what you would think it would do. And then these administration tools really just combine both of those into tools that you can use for a usable interface. So that's pretty much all there is to that. But that's what that does. Identity management for Unix, a kind of a group of tools that you can use to allow your Windows users to use a Unix environment. And then another one of those tools relating to interoperability was part of those identity management tools that I just showed you, and you saw that there was an option there for password synchronization. This is part of those identity management for Unix tools that you can install, the role services items. And what this does is it's going to synchronize the password changes between Unix and Active Directory. So if the user, maybe they're more accustomed to Unix and they change their password in a Unix environment, it will reflect that change and synchronize it up with Active Directory. Likewise, if they're more accustomed to or use Active Directory environment, when they change their password, it'll sync it up to the Unix servers. So it goes back and forth either way. Just make sure that everything stays synchronized and therefore allows the user to have the access that they need to have. This does have something that you need to consider very carefully, though. It requires the same password requirements between both Unix and Active Directory. For example, if Unix requires a 12-character password, but in Active Directory they're only required to have 7 characters, well, if they change their password in Active Directory to 7 characters, then Unix is not going to be able to accept that, and you're going to have an error that occurs. So make sure that you have some consistency there and uniform password requirements. Also, it's generally considered a bad idea to replicate sensitive accounts between these. So with those, and probably it's going to be more advanced users anyway, or administrators. So for those folks, you might have to have them manually change their passwords on both platforms. A big interoperability item that you'll also find you need to work around is that you need to get Unix-based applications to often work on Windows machines. I mean, after all, especially at least in terms of where people sit and which machines they work with, it's predominantly becoming Windows desktops nowadays. But a lot of those Unix applications are certainly very good, so we need to find a way to make those Unix-based applications work on Windows. And for that, we'll use this subsystem for Unix-based apps. Okay. Now what that gives us is it gives us a Unix shell that we can work with, which is just usually just a command line kind of a shell. We get some scripting languages that we can use, a software development kit, most everything else we need to be able to get common Unix types applications to be able to work within Windows. Also, by the way, how do we get the subsystem for Unix-based apps installed? What you'll do there is, and again, none of this is very intuitive, I don't think, but here you'll go to Features and add Features. Okay, it's not a. How do you know if the difference between whether or not it's a feature or whether or not it's a role? I don't know. It's very difficult to determine the difference between those and how Microsoft defines those at times. So sometimes you gotta poke around a little bit. But here we go. Subsystem for Unix-based applications, and that's pretty much all you need to do. Just next finish your way through that, and you'll have what you need there. Also, part of the things that we installed earlier when we were installing the identity management for Unix, you saw that one of the options there included Server for NIS, which is Network Information Services, and that's a Unix item. This is very useful for consolidation and migration purposes. A Server for NIS can only be installed on a Windows Server 2008 domain controller, and it's going to be able to then act as a master NIS server, kind of like a domain controller for Unix, if you will. And this allows us to help consolidate to a single namespace for both our NIS and NIS servers and Windows domains. And then, of course, a critical part of integrating Unix and Windows environments is something called Services for NFS, which is the network file system for Unix. And this will allow your Unix clients to access Windows shares. And the way you'll do that is also, again, not all that intuitive, I don't think, but what we'll do with this one is we'll go to File Services, and then notice that we can click Add Role Services here. This is not the same as the Add Role Services we saw earlier. Notice that this one, if I go up a little bit, it's really related only to the File Services item. Okay, there it is, Services File for Network File System. If we clicked on this button here, then it would start the wizard for us. There's also, if I go up here, there's also this Add Role Services. It's not the same one. It's different depending on your context within this console. So it gets a little bit confusing sometimes. And if I go on down, in fact, I could go down here to Add Role Services once again. So you can see even in the same interface, it actually appears twice. It's actually pointing to different things, though. So here I would then choose Services for Network File System, and that's how I would install that item there. So that gives you kind of a rundown on the various interoperability tools and things that you'll need to add from Windows Server 2008 to integrate into a Unix type environment. In this nugget, we talked about upgrading and migrating domains, and then a totally unrelated interoperability. So it kind of killed two birds with one stone and got it all into one nugget here. One of the first things we talked about, though, was a domain upgrade. Remember, this is an easy way to go to a Windows Server 2008 domain, and it doesn't require any additional hardware. But it kind of requires that you leave everything the way it is in terms of your domain structure. But you might decide you want to restructure your domain instead. Maybe you want to collapse some domains or something like that. Well, then you might need to go ahead and install new domains and then migrate your old domains into the new structure that you've come up with. You can also just do an upgrade and then a restructure. So you're kind of doing both. You start off with an upgrade, and then you just make sure that everything's up and running and it seems to like Windows Server 2008. And then you can restructure by collapsing domains or even adding domains, whatever you need to do there. We also took a look at the Active Directory migration tool, which would be critical to the restructure process, especially if you're moving accounts from one domain to the next. And by the way, ADMT would also allow you to migrate from totally separate forests into another forest. Then there's also the Active Directory Federation Services, which is where we could exchange resources without establishing an entire forest trust, for example. And then finally, we talked a lot about interoperability, particularly with Unix clients. Or Windows clients in Unix environments, either way. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.